Okay, we're going to look at a basic form so that we can start describing light and shadow. And my basic form is an egg. Nice organic volume. Gives us something simple to start with. Now the shape of the egg is certainly oval. It's spherical, but with more of a point on the end over here. It's not entirely essential that it's perfect, but get it as close as you can. And this is a very broad shape drawn with an HB pencil. And I'm going to also lightly rough in our cast shadow as well. So the HB is a light mid-tone pencil, and it's not going to scratch the surface of the paper like a 2H might. So by doing this, we're maintaining as much integrity of the surface of the paper as possible. I have essentially gotten it roughed in where I need to. I'm going to take and very lightly separate light from shadow on the form, very lightly, and then I'm going to pull my grayscale out. And this is our tool to kind of see what range of light and dark is possible within our graphite. And I'm going to hold it up against my subject and sort of identify some tones that I see. So when I look at things, there's a recessed dark, and I'm going to take something soft, a 3B here. You can use a 4B, you can use a 2B, and I'm going to look at something of the darker range for the cast shadow. 60% potentially to get started with. It's going to go darker, but I always like to start towards something a little bit lighter. And so I'm looking at this here, kind of working with a wash of graphite first. I'm not scribbling back and forth, but I'm going to lay in the pencil weight a little more loosely, a little more broadly, and even take it into the form of the egg a little bit. I'm doing this with short loops, little loops like this, and making the marks only on one stroke, on one direction, like pull forward or pull away from you. That I'm not scribbling back and forth, so that it allows you to essentially feather the edge a bit, meaning that you're going to take and provide a little bit of contrast along the edge of that pencil weight. Let me grab something real quick. So on a scrap sheet of paper here, I'm looking at light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. This is feathering the edge. So light pressure, heavy pressure, lessen it off. So the edges become something that we can blend a little bit more, meaning I can do the next pass and overlap those strokes without getting marker overlap, where you're kind of scribbling like this and then you scribble like that back over top of it, and you wind up with this dark passage. So by feathering it helps soften that blow, if you will, and blend it together. And it's with a very flat application, where the surface of the paper is given a long part of the barrel of the graphite here. So it's laying flatter against it. So I'm not going in with this kind of handwriting grip. Okay, I'm going to do that very lightly here as well. As I get more to an edge, I'm going to be very specific, slow down a little bit, and then I'm going to weave in multiple directions so that the directional grain of the marks is going to vanish essentially into the gray tone. There's a little buildup right there. I want to keep an eye on that, so like if that continues to keep catching all the pencil weight, I'm going to lift it out very surgically with a kneaded eraser. The edge of the shadow is a little softer compared to the form of the outside contour. And we can look at that more specifically as we get closer to finalizing things. So I'm going to come at it from a different angle here. I already did a kind of vertical direction. I am somewhat aware of the local color difference between the cast shadow being a little bit darker, the value of the egg in the shadow as being a little bit lighter. But what I'm thinking about mostly right now is flattening the tone in. So we're gonna speed this process up a little bit, and I'm just gonna draw. And we'll come back and start talking about things once I've divided the light from the shadow. Okay, now that I have this flat impression essentially of light versus shadow, and shadow is in that 50-60% range right now, we start to blend. We start to move away from that. I've created a light mass and a shadow mass. The unit of shadow shape is going to be subdivided, and because I already have paper white that's as bright as I can get, it's a good idea to go in and establish the darkest dark. So this is a 6B graphite pencil, and I'm going to essentially lightly wash over this. The graphite, because it's softer, isn't going to go into the cracks of the paper really significantly, but it's going to introduce a little bit more graphite onto the surface that I can then move around with a harder pencil. And I'm doing this with a very light touch, just putting it a little bit on. Because I was using a 3B, my options here are to take my 3B and sharpen it a little bit more so I get a cleaner point. In which case you can push down into the grain of the paper a little bit more. It's going to take some of the extra graphite on the top of the surface of the paper texture and smooth it in. I'm doing this with a little less long stroke. It's still, I'm not making little circles or anything. I'm dragging lines out, but they are more precise than those initial layers that I was applying. The shadow will get lighter as it comes out, away from the connection point to the table surface, so this recessed, it's called an occlusion shadow, where occlude basically means to block, and our form, our object, is blocking the light from the surface of the table. So I'm going to introduce a gradient coming away. The recessed dark, though, right here will be the darkest point. It, in comparison to something that might be black, won't reach the full dark that the graphite is able to do, because it doesn't get that dark. I would have room to push it a little further if I put a black pencil into the scene, if I put a black piece of paper under the egg, it could get darker. And so I'm thinking relative to the values that are in front of me. It's not quite pure dark, so it's not going to reach the darkest that the graphite can go. So I'm going to let it kind of stop there. This is going to fade out. I'm going to continue to work on that. And while I'm working with this 3B still, I'm going to compare it to what's happening on the egg. So right now we've just divided light from shadow. The next step on the form of the egg is to introduce blended halftones out. And so I'm going to put my 3B away because that's too soft. I want to think about what represents that color on the egg. So I'm going to hold my grayscale out under the light and compare it to what I see happening in the halftones. And I'm in this range, so I'm going to use a B. And because the lines will become more visible in the halftones, I want to be very aware of the marks that I'm making and not contradict the form of the egg too much. So I'm moving with the roundness here. I might switch over to a little more horizontal, and there's going to be some transitional blending where they overlap, kind of crosshatch. They will likely eventually blend out more with the subsequent layers that I do, but what I'm doing is bringing the edge of the shadow up the form a little bit. But we're not going to sacrifice the immediate kind of no-tan impression that it's a light shape against a dark shape. So as you're doing this, the next step is to redefine that boundary. So it's slowly fading up a little bit. I'm going to continue a little bit higher with this for the moment. Again, these are kind of shorter strokes. I'm still thinking about feathering those edges. Starting to cross-hatch over. It's all about the rhythm that those marks build up in relationship to what's already existing or what's going to happen next. So as I get out here, slowly start to turn it a little bit so it goes around the point of the egg, if you can call it a point. The harder pencil weights, this is a B, this is a 3B originally. The harder pencil weights will show a different kind of mark. So as I get closer to right here, this was done with a 3B, I'm going to move back to the 2B. So I have a similar softness, it's a little bit harder. And I'm going to establish the core shadow. And that's the dark that happens along the terminator line of the form, which is where that light terminates in its ability to hit the surface. So the light rays are coming down tangentially along this line, essentially. So the light rays are coming down, but they stop short. They're still hitting right there, but they're not hitting right there, and so it falls around on a ring. And as you look at the cast shadow on the ground, that is a mirror image, or it's this shape, this terminator line, that's the shape of the shadow. That can help you if you're thinking about a complicated form that you might be trying to cast a shadow down on the ground. You ask yourself, where's that light coming from? What would a cross section right through that part of the egg, or let's say a human figure, if you were trying to cast their shadow on the ground, where's the light coming from? Right now it's pretty much top down, so we can almost look at a slice horizontally as what the shape would be that's cast onto the ground. That's what we would look at on a more complicated form as well. So while I'm here, I'm thinking about the separation between light and shadow. Shadow is got a lot more rendering going on right now, and that's something I'm going to keep an eye on, because it's not where I necessarily want the viewer. It's the underplane, so I'm going to look at softer edges down there, but it's immediately where there's more graphite applied. So we get started there, and we have to do less work in the light tone right now. But this is a light shape, this is a dark shape. Everything that is in the shadow is darker than what's in the light. Okay, so the halftone that's starting to pull away here, that halftone is brighter than anything in the dark. The brightest bright in the dark is still darker than anything in the light. And so that's the one kind of truism that you need to learn and kind of memorize. And you're going to find situations when that's not true, but you will also find that it's important to maintain that contrast whenever possible. So I'm going to continue kind of finessing this core shadow. Again, this is a 2B, it's a kind of sharp point on it. It's going to be used to continue to focus the grain, and while it's still sharp, I may even come out to the edge here and really clarify the outside contour. But if you're a heavy hand, a 2B is not the one that I would use. I might use an HB or a B. You really want to think about what kind of pencil weights are going to be right for you. So I've got a relatively light touch. I can push a nice sharp edge in there to clarify the outside contour, and then finesse and fade that in to the form. Okay, so we're going to watch this sped up while I continue to apply core shadow. Okay, now I've pushed the core shadow, and again, this is where the light terminates on its trip around the form, bringing more contrast to that initial wash. Remember, this was basically just a flat wash of dark that grouped those shadows. I haven't erased the light out. What I'm trying to think about is that initial wash becomes the reflected light. That's the light that's hitting the surface of the paper here, bouncing up into the underside of the egg. I'm trying to draw around it and reduce the need to use an eraser as much as I can. When I did use the eraser, it was very small moments. But I've been using a 3B. This is a 2B on top. It was sharper. So the harder pencil weight and the sharpness of the pencil will push the graphite down into the texture of the paper. If you want to smooth it out more, we could continue to take a sharp pencil weight. It's going to darken it though, so you have to be ready for that. If you've gotten it to the value that you want to, then you need to work to try to achieve the same texture throughout so that the egg feels like it's made of the same material and doesn't all of a sudden become burlap here and smooth eggshell up there. So the texture that you introduce on the top should be similar in a way. Now this is a B pencil. I'm going to continue to push some halftones now that I've reintroduced the contrast between the light and shadow. But maintaining contrast between the light as a whole and what's happening down here. So this reflected light, I can't get that value here or it's going to start to flatten the form. So I still need to maintain that level of contrast. I can always push this darker, but I'm relatively happy with where that is right now, so I want to be really gentle about the pressure. But this application will be very light, more textural even. As we turn from the light to the shadow in this moment, that is where you will pick up more texture. So we've seen that in the slides of a golf ball or the moon, the division between the light and the shadow. You see that texture build up. So we can see a little bit more there. So it's not bad to kind of allow that to happen just based on how you're applying or laying the pencil weight down on the surface. And really that's what I'm doing. I'm not putting much pressure. I'm letting the weight of my pencil hit the surface and be very specific about going into little brighter areas that may need just a little mark in there to kind of flatten them. Paper texture isn't perfect. It may have some areas, there was a build-up down here that I had to pick up. Small little moments. You have to just keep an eye on it. Okay, so I'm moving up now into the light more. And so the B is not necessarily the pencil I want to use. I'm going to shift just one weight harder with the HB and work towards the highlight. Now the highlight is right here. I can, for my own sake, go in and very lightly rough it in with a 2H. Just kind of circle around it, but be aware of what you're doing. That circle may not be there. I may want to erase that when I get to it, but I want to give myself a landmark. And right now I'm just going to kind of lightly touch this. I'm not scrubbing, trying not to smear with this. Just kind of lift it off so that I can control where that back edge is more precisely. It was roughed in initially with this HB still. So I'm looking at it from different directions, try to capture the shape of the egg that I like. Because this is the brightest part, that's paper white. Every other part of the egg has to be darker. And this is the back edge of the egg. So the outside contour may feel softer than what exists, say, right here. This part of the egg is slightly closer to me, and it's got a darker shading. It's got a core shadow, so I'm going to use the sharper HB right now to kind of finesse that a little bit. This is also a nice sharper moment, and so the texture is going to be focused a little bit because I'm dragging a harder pencil over top of the soft weight. And so the texture in the middle can start to come forward because we gravitate towards texture. The smoothness can help that fade around because technically this is the closest point on the egg to me. It's closer than that. So the more texture I have there, the more it comes forward. And so I'm going to build now towards that middle. Again, because the pencil weight is an HB, it's darker. I have to be very gentle. Every mark will show, so you want to be in a good headspace, if you will. Like right there, I could hear something outside my studio door, and my pencil just laid on a little harder than I wanted it to. So you want to be slow about this. You're in no rush. A drawing with graphite should kind of build in layers and wash up if you're really trying to render it accurately. And there's a time and a place for, being more spontaneous and everything, but this is about analysis, learning to see and observe. So these moments of real kind of practice will be called upon later as you have more creative freedom, if you will, to take what you know and apply it gesturally, apply it with creativity. This isn't as much about creativity, right? It's just learn to render what you see in front of you. And some of you are going to really love that. Some of you are going to find it tedious. So by all means, this is almost meditative in a way. You're slowly building it up. Give yourself that time to do so. Give yourself the freedom to come in and care about this egg from first mark to last mark, because it will show in those moments that you've tried to do it quickly compared to another area. You've run out of time. You spent a lot of time on an area in a drawing, and then it's due in an hour. So you've got to rush through the last bits. Try to manage building up things in these big passages where you've separated light and shadow. You build those all up across the whole picture, and then you come back and do another pass towards the halftones. Then you come back and do a pass towards the lights, and you're really touching lots of it uniformly, all kind of building up, so you reach those finishes at the same time, essentially. All right, so that was HB. I'm going to shift to the H pencil weight, and I'm going to pull my grayscale back out and really make a comparison. What do I see on the egg in terms of those light halftones? So I do see a lot of this H pencil weight here, right in here. So I'm going to look to kind of reach that, and we're going to do that again with very light pressure. I'm still going to build from the halftone so I get a feel for the sharpness of that pencil and be real sensitive to how it's applied. So it's likely not showing up too much on the camera because it is so light, but we're going to start to speed the process up here again, and we'll start to look at it more towards the highlight again. Okay. Okay, so I've pushed the halftones around, and there's a gradient of light to dark moving away. While I squint, I still want to maintain that core shadow strength, so it's oftentimes necessary to come back, take a few more strokes across the core shadow just to deepen it. It's also a good place to follow or pick up any of the rhythms that you had with the long strokes with the H pencils up here, and find them at least visibly present in some of your mark making on the other side, in the dark side. That way it feels like there's some continuity between the two sides. So since there's some visible marks, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at continuing to accentuate the darks, where I might push this just a little bit darker now. Lay some strokes a little more horizontally even, and across some of these diagonal ones at the top. The edge of the shadow is softer because the form that's casting it, this part of the egg, is further away. If you have a more architectural, geometric object which has a clear rectilinear form, where it touches the surface of the table might be right on top of it. It might be immediately contacting the surface. And so the shadow that builds off of that will be sharper, and then it will slowly soften out. And so what would be looking for here is the edge to be soft as it is already, but to do it with a little more of a hard pencil weight. So I grab my H, and the hard pencil weight will just blur it a little bit more. You won't see it so much as individual marks that have concluded, as much as you'll just see the blur. So I'm kind of taking little loops here again. Going back in, making sure that I also kind of fade that over the texture a bit so it's not an abrupt kind of change in texture. I'm looking to smooth that out. Almost like a Gaussian blur filter in Photoshop. Continue to blur that touch along the edge. But again, I'm also going to pass it over the rest of it. Not a lot of pressure, just enough where it doesn't feel like it's a kind of a anomalous change. Like all of a sudden you're drawing with charcoal over an oil painting or something, that it looks so different potentially. So by blending it in there, it looks like that the surface of the texture is almost underneath the blended texture here. It's underneath the more soft pencil weights that were done initially. This is definitely a final kind of pass on it. If you do this part too soon, the harder pencil it'll take the texture of the paper and kind of eliminate it, kind of push it down more than you want to. The other thing you'll notice, I have not blurred it with my fingers. I have not taken a tortillon stump and dragged that across it to smudge the surface. I am being very careful about building it up. Haven't done really much erasing at all. Very small little elements with the kneaded eraser where you shape it to a point and say, that little moment's too dark, so boop, and lift it out. Being very conscious of choices that you're making. Now sometimes you'll also see in the shadow where it kind of gets a glow in the middle there. The reflected light is actually filling in the shadow, and so it may have this little just a little darker quality along the edge. And sometimes you just build it up away from that mid-tone on either side. You darken this way, and you darken on the other side. So just look at what's happening in the shadow, but make sure it happens within the value shape that you've already created, meaning that you're not going back in and erasing, you're just building around it. This is a B. It's nice and sharp. So I'm trying not to go too much soft pencil back over top of hard pencil. I'm taking harder pencils over top of soft pencils. So I started with 3 and 6B, took a 2B over it. This is a B now. And along the edge I was taking that H. And now I'm going back in and just pushing it a little darker so that the bounce light coming off of the surface of the table, filling in here, also kind of reflects back down. Likewise, the shadow kind of allows the bottom edge here to blur. So when you look at student work, oftentimes we'll see this kind of cut out. It looks like a collage. It looks like someone's literally cut the egg out and pasted it on top of a shadow because the bottom contour is just too sharp. Look for it to be softer and look for it to be darker than anything in the halftone. So you want to squint, and if it feels like it's getting close in brightness, knock it back a little bit. Make sure it stays in the shadow. So that's what I'm doing with final touches. I continue to look around the egg for moments that would be softer. Moments that when you squint, they stand out more on your drawing than they do on the form. And so that's a continual process. Squint at your drawing, squint at the object that you're drawing. And you want a similar impression. If you're not getting a similar impression, look for where it's different. So I will continue to look at, are there any edges along here where they feel softer or too sharp? There's a moment there with the graphite that feels like it's a little darker. Either I continue pushing that contrast away, or it's something that I would push a very light lift with the kneaded eraser and just adjust that. But I'm looking at that top edge and saying it's a softer moment. The contrast on the contour happens here and here, softens out. It's even a little bit sharper, I think, down here than it is up there. So I'm going to take final pass over this, and then we'll take a look at the final piece. Okay, so we've gotten to a point that feels like a pretty good statement of shadow versus light. This value is surrounded by darks, but it's still just a little bit darker. And if it's not, you do another pass. But you can get some brightness there. What I would encourage you to look for is, where is it brightest? This part here is closer to the surface than this part here because it's lifting off. Away. Same over here. So there could be more brightness right there than there is on either left or right sides. Make sure your highlight is standing out to a point that you can see it. It's not that it needs to be sharply outlined or defined, but that it is brighter and that there are sort of incremental gradient stages down, stepping away from that highlight. So you could continue to finesse this, but light versus shadow, within the shadow there are a few values, within the light there are a few values, but they don't overlap in terms of bleeding into one another. And we've got softer edge versus sharper edge, softer edge versus sharper edge. You might have a moment that gets lost into the other forms, but that's going to just provide the viewer some interest, provide the viewer some explanation of how the form is working there. So look at how the object overlaps something that's on the ground. This form is overlapping its cast shadow, and so we want to look for a change in sharpness there. Softer edge to the cast shadow all the way around. You will have an opportunity to find variation between those cast shadows based on those forms. Okay, so I look forward to seeing what you all come up with in terms of our graphite renderings, and I hope you've enjoyed this.